cross the river, it looks like it's a huge gap with all of the apocalyptic literature, the signs, the symbols, the dragons, right? But from another standpoint, the historical context, it's not as wide a gap as we'd like to believe, right? So that's what that means. Measure the width of that river. Number 3, we talked about this last week, cross the principalizing bridge. All right, so that's what it means in their town. We got to get it to our town, so we got to cross the river, and we cross the river by understanding what are the principles that the biblical author was teaching those people then and there that still apply to us here and now. What are the principles? Okay, I want to give you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ways to figure out if you've got the principle, if you've got the theological truth that's being taught in a text. Okay? Number 1, is the principle tied to and reflected in the biblical text? All right, how do I know if I've pulled the right principle out here to apply to my life? Well, number 1, if it is actually in the biblical text. All right, do you understand what I mean by that? All right, so my student is reading Ephesians 4 and 5, and this is so crazy, I can't even get my mind around what he said. And he's a good little preacher, he is. The standard for the Christian lifestyle is determined by the empowerment of the Spirit and not by the sufficiency of grace. Well, my first question was, where is that in the text? Show me in the text where you got that. Have you ever noticed that when I preach through a text, as I'm getting down to whatever my points or movements are, I will say, look in verse 33. Have you ever noticed we do that all the time? Look down in verse 24. Do you see where it says there this? Well, what I'm doing there is showing you in the biblical text where I got that idea. I didn't just pull this out of the air. This is actually something that comes out of the text. And so I'm constantly pushing you there. So when my student sends me this little phrase, my first question is, where does that come from the text? And that's a big thing. In my preaching classes, they'll come up, I got 4 points here, this, and this. And I'm always asking them, where did you get that? Have you ever heard a preacher preaching on a text and you thought to yourself, where is he getting this? I know you have, but not in the last 14 years. No, I'm just kidding. If that's the feeling you get when you're reading through a biblical text, where is he getting this? Then he's not doing a very good job of actually preaching the text, giving you what the text says. Okay? So, as you think, have I understood this correctly? Am I getting the right principle here? Ask yourself, first of all, is it tied to the biblical text? It should come directly from the text. Number 2, and this one's hard. Is the principle timeless and universal, or is it attached to a particular historical situation? All right, let me say that again. Is the principle timeless and universal, or is it tied to a particular situation? All right, do you understand what we just said? This question is at the heart of the recurring debate in the Churches of Christ about women's roles. And before I say anything else about it, I do not intend to have that conversation today. Just so we're clear. All right? So keep your questions to yourself at this point. When folks look at the passages in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy, they seem to be pretty straightforward. Well, okay, if I could cuss out loud, I would. Okay, 1 Timothy 2. Let me show you what I mean here. If I'm gonna say it, I got to say it. But you're not gonna discuss it with me. And it's not because I think something liberal. You and I probably think the same thing about this text. Okay, but let me show you what I mean. In 1 Timothy 2, verse 12, is the real situation, where Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing if she continues in faith and love and holiness and self-control. All right, so what is the principle here, and is it universal or is it time constrained? Okay. If you're not aware, this is a huge issue on the Harding campus right now. Not among the Bible faculty, but among the students. In fact, they staged themselves a little protest last year, and it was like telling Bruce, you know, when are you going to change these rules and blah, blah, blah. And the board, when is the board going to change its mind? Well, wait a minute. Is it a closed-minded board, or is it people trying to read the text and interpret it correctly? You see, you're just assuming it's some closed-minded, bigoted white guy, right? Because that's the trouble with everything in the world today. You're not thinking it could possibly be something else. One of the things people say about this text is, well, in order to understand what Paul's saying here about women, you've got to understand what the historical context was. Now, if I read through 1 and 2 Timothy, I get a pretty clear picture that some women are being targeted with false teaching. Women in particular. Okay? You read on into 2 Timothy, we read about televangelists convincing weak-willed women to send in big checks. Not exactly, but you get it. So there's something going on there. There's also something going on in the environment around Ephesus, where women in particular, when they go to the pagan temples, are really making a show of it with their ostentatious garb and there are some historical things to be considered here. There is a historical context into which this was written. And it may very well make a difference in how we view this text. The only problem I have with this text is in verse 13, Paul's first argument is that Adam was formed first and then Eve. That's his first argument. And his first argument has to do not with certain historical situations, but a universal creational context. Paul takes us back and says, look, let's think about how God created things. Let's think about how he created the man. Let's think about how he created the woman. Let's think about the roles and responsibilities he gave to the man and the roles and responsibilities he gave to the woman. And whatever God intended in creation is whatever God intended in the home, is whatever God intended in the church. Now that's his first argument, which leads me to believe that the way I should look at this is not so much particular to that historical context as it is to all contexts because of the creation argument. Are you following this at all? Okay, now, you've heard me preach before that I think some of us have taken this way too far. And these texts have been used to abuse women and to keep them in their place. And I think if you're doing that, you got to deal with other texts. Okay, that's the part I'm not ready to get into right now. I'm not going to debate it right now. You've heard me preach it here before, so just go back and listen to it online. But all I'm trying to do here is illustrate the tension. Okay? The second thing we've said is the principle timeless and universal, or is it attached to a particular historical context? That's a big deal. All right? As long as I'm getting fired, let's talk about the instrumental music. Don't you think it's weird? Don't answer, it's a rhetorical question. This is the way to handle a class. You just tell them you're not answering their questions. Tell them whatever you want. Right? That's why I like to preach. Anyway, don't you think it's weird that in the Old Testament there's instruments everywhere? And then we read a text last week about all the harps being played in heaven. But for this 2,000-year period of time, God really seems to be against that. Okay, the reason I bring it up, Bob, turn your recorder on. I am firmly within the a cappella tradition of the Churches of Christ. Firmly. Okay, good. I feel like I need to defend myself. Yeah, Tim's recording all this, isn't he? I'm firmly within that tradition. But I can understand people who disagree with it. I can understand where they're coming from. Because when they read the Psalms, I mean, this is a great illustration. How do we understand the Psalms? When Psalm 150 says, praise the Lord with tambourine and the bongos, well, I just made that up, but the other instruments, I just don't know what they are. When it says very specifically, praise the Lord with your instruments, I guess, should I just not preach that? Is that like Psalm 137, dash your babies against the rocks, don't preach that one? And then don't preach 150 about praising the Lord with your instruments? You really think that the Lord would, okay, I can't get into that. I'm trying to get us away from one kind of thinking and into another. Usually when we have the instrumental music discussions, well, I think and I feel. Well, I'm glad you do. Can you show me where that is in the text? You may be thinking and feeling that way for a reason. And it may be because you've looked at the text and the text supports that. Okay. How do I deal with those texts? Is there a principle there? Well, we could say, well, the principle's praise. We could say the principle's praise God with all you've got. Okay? Is the principle timeless and universal, or is it attached to a particular historical situation? Let me tell you the truth about instrumental music. There is no denying the fact in the Old Testament was the primary way that people praised through sacrifice and then through the Levitical choirs and things like that. If you don't believe me, read Psalms and read 1 Chronicles, okay? In 586 BC, something really significant happened in the life of Judah and Israel. And that is Jerusalem was destroyed, and so was the temple. Say it out loud. Temple. Okay. All of Israel's religious life had been bound up in the temple. You know that? With all of the sacrifices led by the priests and all of the praising led by the priests. Well, all of a sudden the temple is destroyed. The priests are carted off into Babylonian exile. Where does the church worship in exile? Okay? Where do they worship? They can't go to the temple. Who leads the worship? Priests are scattered to the four corners. What do? Well, there was a significant change that was made in the exile. Little groups of worshipers started popping up all over the Mediterranean world in places called synagogues. Wherever there were 10 Jewish men, you could find a synagogue. And synagogue worship was very simple. It wasn't attached to all of the pomp and circumstance of the temple, okay? Sacrifice was replaced by study of the Word. There was this understanding that we got ourselves into this mess because we didn't take the covenant and the words of the covenant seriously, so we're going to learn it, we're going to dedicate ourselves to it, we're going to read it. This is when scribes become more important than priests do, because they could read and they could write and they could teach, okay? And worship also became very simple. Without all the temple apparatus, you basically had repeat after me sort of singing. That's the kind of worship service Jesus attended every Sabbath in the synagogue. Very simple. Reading of the scriptures, prayers, back and forth, repeat after me singing. The synagogues that have been uncovered by archaeologists all have benches and podiums. Does that sound familiar? Any of it? Well, it should. Look around us, right? It's still going on. All right. It's the way Jesus worshiped. It's the way Paul worshiped. Instruments of music, instruments, weren't introduced into the Christian worship service till 967 AD. 967. Now, what that means to me is, it's documented historical record, okay? What that means to me is that the Christian church worshiped for 1,000 years without the aid of instruments. Now the question is that because of the particular historical situation in which the church found itself, or were there deeper theological principles at play that said this is the way that it ought to be done? All right, do you understand the question? I've given you the historical situation. Do you understand the question? Okay. And the bell has rung, so. You know, the early church actually wrote about this. Jesus did not write about it. I don't think Paul wrote about it. But the early church did. The early church was pretty staunch in its a cappella position because they said, for one thing, this is a new thing. It's not a Jewish thing. And so we have a different style of worship. We don't want it to be confused with temple worship. All right? So there was a theological rationale. They also said we don't want it to be like pagan worship. Pagan worship is raucous and, you know, all of that going on. We don't want to be like that. Isn't it interesting that the argument people are using today is, well, everybody loves music and we need to be like that, when the original argument against it was everybody likes it, we don't need to be like that? Okay, especially in the worship. All right, so there were theological rationale. Now, I heard all my life is, well, they were in hiding, and so you didn't want to draw attention to yourself with your band. That's not true. It's just not true. They weren't in hiding, okay? And by 300, the church is going to be the state religion. So nobody's in hiding their instruments. Number two, I've always heard that they were poor, so they didn't have money for their instruments. Well, that's not true either, all right? These homes that were big enough to house these churches, okay, were filled with some wealthy people. Now, they weren't all wealthy, just like everybody here is not wealthy. But the idea that we don't have our piano because we're not wealthy, it's just not true. So the question is, how do we decide what to do today? I've given you the historical context. I've given you the theological rationale that has been used. There is a historical rationale and there is a theological rationale, but how do I proceed when I cannot necessarily go to book, chapter, and verse and say, well, it says thou shalt not use thine instruments. I applied for a job one time where before they would hire me, and they hired me, I don't know how. There was a 40-question questionnaire, and one of the questions was, do you believe that people who use instruments will go to hell? Well, I walked those people through exactly what I'm telling you right now, and I said, look, I can't deny Old Testament worship. I can't deny what Revelation envisions, but I do know this, that historically, did you know the word a cappella does not mean without instruments? Did you know that? The word a cappella is a Latin phrase that means in the chapel style. What happened was the style of music that was popular in the church was so different it got its own name. Oh, that's the way the church does it. Okay, because of that historical situation, that Jesus and the disciples saw no reason to change, that Paul saw no reason to improve upon. Because of that, because of some of those theological things that make me think, Paul's going to say in 1 Corinthians 14, the problem with instruments is that they don't say anything. And sometimes we don't even know the tune. Well, if I put that together with what Paul says in other places about the purpose of singing to be teaching and admonishing and encouraging, then I come out with a theology that says, okay, I'm firmly committed to the a cappella singing in the church. Okay? It might also surprise you to know that almost all of the historical church leaders have been firmly in the a cappella camp, including Martin Luther, John Calvin, and the Wesley brothers, who were noted hymnists. Is that a word? Is that a thing? They were hymn writers. So the move has been very recent. But here's what I'm wanting to get you to see. We got off onto this because, is the principle timeless and universal? Or is it attached to a particular situation? And so that's something we've got to navigate here. And while I am firmly in this a cappella camp, I understand why some people aren't, Bob. I didn't answer yes or no. I did what I did to you. I said, am I firmly committed to the a cappella Church of Christ? I am, but I can understand why some people aren't. And I don't think it's my job to send them to hell. Now, the problem was they thought it was. I think there are reasons to send people to hell. I mean, not me, but to say if you don't stop what you're doing, that's where you're headed. I mean, I think there are times to say that, but I couldn't say it about that. And another thing about this, everybody will say, well, it's not a salvation issue. Well, what is a salvation issue and what's not? Who gets to determine that? Anyway, well, okay. Half of you hate me now, and the other half are like, that's what I always thought. I just didn't have anybody say it for me. Well, oh boy, not a good place to be in. Happy New Year, okay?